Vampires, terrors of the night, the monster of man made manifest in undead flesh. Supernatural powers fueled by blood and darkness. Whether animalistic predators on the edge of civilization or charming lords ruling over their lessers, they are the predators of man. Hello, adventurers! I am the Welsh DM, the one Welshman whose accent turned into a bat and flew off into the night. And on this entry into the Bestiary, we are going to be talking about vampires, the dark rulers of the night. Dracula, Strahd, Cass the Bloody-Handed. How can we use these titular and infamous monsters in our D&D and fantasy TTRPG games? And how do we go about making sure they rightly terrify our players at the tabletop? As with all of these videos, we are going to break down the themes, tones, and narrative genres we can tell with these villains. We're going to focus on some adventure hooks that you can use at your own tables, and then we're going to modify the stat block to make it really sing at the tabletop and properly terrify your players, before considering how we should run that encounter to make sure it's as memorable as it can be. So let's get on with it. The themes and tones that we can play with vampires are well established at this point. They have been written about through human history for decades at this point, and most avenues for their types have been explored, but that doesn't mean we can't tell interesting stories ourselves, as well as potentially twist them to surprise our players in new, slightly dark ways. The first of which we mentioned at the start of this in the cold open. They are the apex predators, the monsters in the night that hunt us, mortal man, who believes ourselves dominant over the rest of the world. It is the most thrilling element of vampirism to me that they are the predator to man, the thing that keeps us in check from taking over and destroying too much. We can use this in our games to sow that fear of being chased by something that's faster than you, stronger than you, hungrier than you, something that wants you far more than you want to survive. It is, if you'll excuse the pun, a juicy vein for us to explore at the tabletop. Alternatively, you might want to explore the classic dynamic of good versus evil, light versus dark with vampires. Throughout history, they are written as this evil entity that rules the night but hides away from the bright light of day. While it has classic religious undertones there, you can do some interesting things with this. If you choose to keep it classical, you can explore the power and the virtue that your player characters bring, the shining light, the sun rising at the dawn, providing hope against the villainous evil that lives in the dark. But not everything is as black and white as this. Consider for a moment the fact that the vampire is just a predator seeking prey. Are they truly evil, or have they just been consigned as such by certain voices? I mean, is a wolf evil for hunting the deer? Castlevania did this best by showcasing that vampires, yes, are evil, are overruling powers that at any moment could tear down humanity. But what was the reason that they started to? In Season 1 of Castlevania, we saw how the church, how these supposed paragons of virtue and light were the reason for vampires coming for humanity. They acted rashly. They gave in to their base desires and fears, causing vampires to seek vengeance on humanity. You could explore this in your TTRPG campaigns. Consider maybe the vampire actually isn't that evil. Maybe the vampire lives on a peaceful commune with a number of willing supplicants who freely give up their blood on a rota to keep their vampire protector safe. And it is the church who is spreading misinformation and trying to bring about the downfall of this so-called evil creature of the night. And the last element of vampirism that I think is worth mentioning upon is the concept of thraldom. Ever since the first vampire story in Dracula from Bram Stoker, we have seen that vampires are capable of enrapturing and charming people to do their bidding and join their cabal. If you feel the predator-prey dynamic of vampires is a bit overdone, then you can explore this concept of control and domination instead. Perhaps it opens up avenues of a political intrigue campaign with vampires sown throughout, meddling in their ways from behind the scenes with certain politicians that they have ceded control over to do their own bidding. There are a number of ways we can take this concept from a simple vampire lord like Strahd to a Machiavellian, Borgia-like system where the vampires are pulling the strings behind the scenes. But we'll get to that in the next section. We've covered the themes and narrative tones that we can explore with vampires, which means we've got a good grounding of how to base our campaign. But we still need an adventure for our players to sink our teeth into and for us to prep. So here's 3 ideas for you to take away to potentially use as vampire-centric adventures at your table. The serial killer. If the apex predator concept is one you want to explore, a great way to do this is to have a spate of murders that leave their bodies scattered around the streets drained of blood. The local guards who aren't into the supernatural or mysticism of the world have no idea who could be doing this or why they are doing it in such a gruesome and disturbing way. But to your players, it's obvious what other creature could be doing this but a vampire draining their foes of blood and then scurrying away into the night. The challenge comes from trying to convince the guards of the vampire's existence. After all, they don't believe in such creatures. They are folk tales used to keep children in at night. And the guards also don't take too favourably to the adventurers interfering in their investigations and might begin to question why the adventurers care so much. Additionally, the vampire is leaving no witnesses and no trace at the crime scene. How could they possibly be tracked back to their lair? Because after all, it's the one place that you can defeat them once and for all. Begin the Hunt takes the premise of a monster hunter like Van Richten or Van Helsing and brings it to your tabletop. There's nothing wrong with a little bit of the classics every now and again. The party are hired by a famous monster hunter within the world to help them hunt down a vampire that they have discovered in a neighbouring kingdom. Along the way, the monster hunter warns them not all vampires are the same. The stories and legends that you've been told growing up are just one type of vampire, and they believe this to be a different one. The party must investigate the surroundings, the nature of this vampire, and come up with a strategy of how to defeat them, learn their strengths and their weaknesses before finally confronting this dangerous vampire in their lair and bringing them to an end. If you want to throw a twist into this, we can take the previous concept and have that vampire is well liked by their community and is not a danger to anyone, and instead the vampire hunter is just dead set on eradicating monsters regardless of morals or the facts of the matter, and maybe the players must make a choice as to who they actually support in that moment. Books such as Grim Hollow's Monster Grimoire or the Big Book of Beautiful Horrors online give you multiple forms of vampires to use in your games and explore different forms of vampirism and the forms that these vampires can take to pose your party multiple different threats even when they believe they've already faced a vampire. And lastly, if you're favouring a little bit of political intrigue, what about the Night Courts adventure? A Game of Thrones-like story of multiple vampire families that rule the world from behind the scenes, gently plucking on the political strings here and there to make sure their agenda grows and their power is kept. A system like Vampire the Masquerade is built upon this premise, so we know it's rich storytelling and it can be achieved in pretty much any system. You could set this up with the party being operatives for one of the families, and when sent to do a mission, they are set up, they are exposed, they are betrayed by the family and left to fend for themselves and survive where they can. Now on the outside looking in, but with critical information, what do the party do? Do they betray their old family? Do they look to tear the whole system down? It's up to them. But they have been exposed and they know too much, which means they are possibly being hunted as well. Can the party successfully balance the line of politics and avoid being ripped apart by an angry vampire that they crossed the line with? Alternatively, if you want a slightly different take on this, consider two vampires have fallen in love from rival families. A Romeo and Juliet story caked in blood and the night. Can the party help them escape and find a new life in a different place, or do they side with the families and try to get in favour with someone more powerful? There are plenty of stories you could tell with this premise, it's just up to you which ones your players dive into and which ones you want to tell. With our adventure in place and the cinematic genre established, it's now time to develop a stat block that we can utilise when our players come face to face with the vampire and properly terrify them. Which is where we get to the official stat block for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. As far as it goes, it's only okay. It doesn't really invoke the speed, ferocity and terror of a vampire in full combat bloodlust, nor does it really have the social power that you probably need it to be if you're running a political intrigue campaign exclusively. We want a vampire to have a cinematic punch to gasp our players and make them truly fear the creature they are facing, and to have to think about how to expose its weaknesses. Before we get started altering the official stat block, it's worth again mentioning third-party sources if you don't really want to have the time to homebrew. Stuff like the Monster Grimoire from Grim Hollow or the Book of Beautiful Horrors contain a huge number of vampire variants that can really diversify these creatures of the night to use at your tabletop. Especially if you're running a longer form campaign and don't want your players to always be fighting the same thing, this gives you a breadth of opportunity and always keeps your players on their toes and having to think about the right way to deal with the new form of vampirism they've encountered. Now, we really want to emphasize the killing ferocity and speed of a vampire with this stat block. The biggest issue I have with the one presented in 2014 is its lack of speed and aggressiveness. It only has a movement speed of 30 feet around, and when it attacks, it does an average of 17 damage a turn. For a predator of man, that is a criminally low amount of damage output, and unless you give them some kind of magical weapon to compensate, it really needs to be bumped up. So, step 1, make them faster. Give them 40 feet of movement speed, give them the ability to dash as a bonus action. Castlevania is a thing that I constantly go back to as a great representation of what vampires could be in D&D, and the speed at which they move around an arena is exactly what we want to go for. Jumping from pillar to wall to roof, these vampires are very hard to stop, and the players need to think about how to contain that speed in the encounter. Step 2, let's bump up their damage. We could give them a magical weapon, as I said, or if we want to continue with the claw theme, which I do quite like, what I would look to do is either increase the damage of them or add a bleed effect. The sheer ferocious and sharpness of a vampire's claws leaves huge gaping wounds of continually leaking blood. I mean, the vampire wants that blood after all, so having your opponent's wounds fail to close and leave their blood exposed is perfectly thematic for a vampire. Maybe a creature takes 1d6 damage at the start of their turn for every attack they've taken until they receive healing, slowly weakening the players further and further, causing them to think about how important it is that they staunch the blood flow, which is probably fueling the vampire. The next point I want to make about the stat block is the fact that it doesn't really do anything for vampires as lords of the night, power over darkness and the creatures therein. Yes, they can summon creatures of the night, and they are vulnerable in sunlight, but it doesn't show them as powerful in the dark. With an intense vulnerability to daylight and sunlight, I would love a complete flip tone. Rather than just their stat block or weakened stat block, we want weakened stat block and strong stat block. So I would look to have the vampire have the ability to cast the darkness spell and then jump from patches of darkness like a teleport shadow step, giving them that sense of darkness is where they are at home, and the players desperately need to stop darkness being a factor in the encounter. If you really want to ramp up the feeling of this vampire having complete control over its domain, showcase an ability to change the passage of sunlight in their domain. Maybe the players have cast daylight and the vampire then just causes it to turn into an eclipse as a blood moon takes over the sky and fuels their vampiric powers even more. Or maybe the party attack at dawn and the vampire just decides to make it dusk as the sun begins to set in their domain, changing the flow of time and showcasing the true power of vampirism in your world. Anything you can do to remind your players who the masters of the night really are. And lastly, let's briefly touch on the charm ability of the vampire presented in the stat block. It's fine, it's sort of usable in combat. It doesn't necessarily deal damage, but it might turn a member of the party out of the action economy slightly, helping to defend the vampire. But it only lasts 24 hours, making it feel like a very one and done or encounter focused power instead of something that you can use with the vampire in a longer form adventure. We've discussed how vampires are capable of enthralling entire communities to work for them, so surely their charm ability should last longer than 24 hours. I would love a world where a vampire manages to charm a party member who is on watch and then disappear into the night. That party member is now their spy, and every so often will go back to the vampire and tell them all the party's plans. The party has a traitor in their midst, but that traitor doesn't even know it. So we've modified the stat block or grabbed one from a third party. It's now time for the climactic final encounter. The party have garlic in hand and the gothic music is blaring. Let's roll some dice. We want to make this encounter memorable, legendary, which means we need to consider how we design this final encounter and how we run it in the moment. The first thing I would recommend, especially with the changes suggested to the stat block, is to make the final environment open and extremely vertical. Allow the vampire to make use of their spider climb ability and their enhanced speed by moving around the battlefield arena, up the walls and leaping from high balconies. It'll force the players to think vertically and force the players to think about how they control the vampire's movement much more than necessarily just dealing damage to it. Make sure there are plenty of chandeliers, hanging tapestries and stained glass windows to invite that creativity from your players to come up with interesting solutions to the problem. Meanwhile, this vampire is leaping from column to balustrade, ripping apart the party, tearing limb from limb and decking their halls in glorious blood. Second point, vampires love thralls, so make sure there are minions in your encounter. Not only does this benefit the encounter by slightly balancing out the action economy, even with weak minions, it presents a really interesting narrative arc. If these thralls are humans from the nearby village, or better yet, NPCs the party knows, what does the party do? How do they handle the situation that people they know, people they care about are attacking them, and they daren't hurt them back? Do they try and find a way to break the vampire's control, or do they find a way to ignore the thralls that are attempting to interfere and stay focused on the vampire? Adding a difficult choice like this to the encounter just opens up what the players are doing and forces them to think more expansively than just big monster do big attack. Of course, if you really want to send a message as to just how powerful your vampire is, have the assembled minions stand back. The vampire commands them to let them play with their food before ripping into the party and showcasing their true power, forcing the party to retreat and come up with another plan. And lastly, and perhaps my favourite thing to consider with any supernatural boss fight, is having a second phase to it. Picture this. The vampire and the party have been ripping into each other for rounds now. The vampire has rent great wounds in the party, but so too the party have stabbed and burnt and prodded at the vampire's form. There are pools of blood along the floor and great splatters of it along the walls. As the vampire drops to one knee, signifying that the party might have the upper hand, the blood in the room begins to rise. It begins to draw into the vampire, seeping into their open wounds, and you see the vampire's eyes turn red. The vampire lets out a bestial roar as the blood suffuses its form and it enters into its pure animalistic nature and begins tearing into the party with an even greater ferocity than before. Tell me that isn't cool. Now, can your party rally and push through and finally put the deadly vampire down, or will they be torn asunder by the vampire in its animalistic form? God, I love vampires. They are the coolest supernatural beings just because they have this face of humanity, but this animalistic nature behind them and the ability to be charming. They are a multitude, and I can never really wait to use them in an adventure again, and I'm probably just going to find a reason to do it again quite soon. But when was the last time you used a vampire in your TTRPG adventures? Have you played Vampire the Masquerade and found it as enthralling, as people say? Did you use a variant vampire, or did you use the one from the Monster Manual? Did you use Strahd? How did you find them? Let me know in the comments below what you would have done differently, what tips and tricks you would give to other GMs out there about how to run these infamous monsters of the night. As per usual, if you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, it does mean a lot, and also you can check out the full Bestiary playlist at the link above. We've covered dragons, we've covered giants, and there'll be more videos coming as well in the series. If you want to make sure you don't miss any videos, make sure to hit subscribe and the bell notification to make sure you are notified when I post up a new video. Anyway, I do believe that's everything I had to say about vampires, for now. So, until we do this again, you keep an eye out for dragons. I'm going to go stab my accent with a stake and hopefully get it to sound right, and I will see you next time.